So, if you asked a construction crew to build a skyscraper, right, and the only blueprint you gave them was like a sticky note that just said, build a tall building.
Yeah, that would be an absolute disaster.
Right. You'd be waiting for the entire thing to just collapse.
No, totally.
But when you look at the United States Supreme Court today...
A marble temple, yeah.
Exactly. This imposing marble temple in Washington. You know, the columns, the robes, the sheer gravity of 9 justices who can, like, strike down federal laws and completely reshape the national landscape with a single ruling.
That's massive.
It is. And we all sort of naturally assume the founders must have designed it exactly this way. Like, we assume there is this meticulously detailed, genius blueprint drawn up in 1787 that explicitly built this towering institution.
I mean, it's entirely natural to assume that, you know.
Yeah.
We crave order when looking back at history. It's comforting to think the people who wrote the Constitution were these architects who knew exactly what they were building, like down to the last rivet. We assume the power they wield today was deliberately engineered.
But then you step into the actual historical record, right? You look at the primary sources, you look at what was actually written on the parchment, and suddenly that imposing marble building just vanishes.
It really does. It's basically a mirage.
Yeah. We are looking at a foundational design that is, honestly, just a blank sticky note. It's incredibly murky.
It is the absolute definition of constitutional muddy waters. Because when you actually read the text of the Constitution, that ironclad certainty we have about the modern court, it completely dissolves.
Which is wild. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are thrilled you could join us for this one. Today, our mission is to investigate the foundational DNA of the United States Supreme Court.
It's a fascinating puzzle.
It really is. We are going to unearth the historical mystery at the heart of the judicial branch. Because, as you'll see, the historical sources reveal a reality that is completely different from, you know, what most of us learned in high school.
Oh, entirely different.
We're going to look at what was actually written down, what was promised to the public, and the intense, almost paranoid arguments that happened before the ink on the Constitution was even dry.
And to start that investigation, we really have to begin with the silence of Article 3.
Okay, set the stage for us.
Right. So when you look at the U.S. Constitution, it's divided into articles that establish the branches of government, right?
Sure.
So Article 1 sets up Congress. And it is long, it's exhausting, it's incredibly detailed about exactly what powers the legislature has.
Yeah.
You know, they can coin money, establish post offices, declare war.
All the specific bullet points.
Exactly. And then Article 2 is the presidency. Again, quite detailed about the commander-in-chief role, treaties, appointments.
Right.
But then you get to Article 3, which handles the entire federal judiciary. And Article 3 is just startlingly brief. I mean, it is by far the shortest of the 3 branch articles.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because saying it's brief almost doesn't do it justice. It's like handing that construction crew the blueprint that leaves out the floor plan, the roof, the electrical wiring, and the plumbing.
That is essentially what happened. You have to picture the delegates at the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787.
In Philadelphia, right?
Right. Specifically a group called the Committee of Detail. And they were exhausted. I mean, they had spent months screaming at each other in a sweltering room over how to balance power between big states and small states.
So they were just over it by the time they got to the courts.
Basically, yeah. By the time they got to the judiciary, they essentially drafted a placeholder. Article 3 establishes, quote, one Supreme Court, and then it just stops. It leaves almost everything else completely blank.
Wow.
They literally punted the actual construction of the judicial system over to future Congresses.
Which is mind-blowing when you think about it, because
Yeah.
the Constitution doesn't even set the number of justices.
Nope. Not at all.
I think almost everyone assumes the number 9 is, like, carved into the original parchment somewhere. But the number of justices was completely up in the air.
It really was.
In fact, the original number was 6, right? And that wasn't invented by the Constitution at all. It was invented by the first Congress in the Judiciary Act of 1789.
Exactly. And they didn't even pick 6 because of some grand philosophical theory. They picked it largely for geographical convenience.
So the justices could ride out to different regions of the country.
Exactly. It was purely logistical. And the text also doesn't even create the lower federal courts.
Wait, really? It doesn't create them at all?
No. It just gives Congress the option to ordain and establish them if they feel like it. Congress could have just decided, you know, nah, state courts are fine, and we wouldn't even have a lower federal bench today.
That is just a skeletal framework, like a rough sketch on a napkin.
It is. But the most shocking omission in the text of Article 3 isn't the number of justices or the lack of lower courts.
Okay, what is it?
The most shocking omission is the single power for which the modern Supreme Court is famous: the power of judicial review.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying the power to strike down laws isn't in there?
It is nowhere in the text.
Seriously?
Seriously. The explicit authority of the court to look at a law passed by the House, passed by the Senate, signed by the President, and then strike it down as unconstitutional.
The big superpower.
Right. That superpower is never explicitly granted in the Constitution.
That is wild. I mean, the defining feature of the branch is missing. If you take away judicial review, what even is the Supreme Court?
Well, without judicial review, you operate much closer to a system like the United Kingdom's, where Parliament is supreme.
Yeah.
If the legislature passes a law, the courts just enforce it. They might interpret ambiguities in the law, but they can't say, this law violates the fundamental charter, so we are erasing it.
Because Parliament has the final say.
It's exactly. Judicial review is the ultimate trump card. And in our Constitution, it is entirely an inference. It's read into the text rather than read from it.
Wow, it's an inference. The superpower is basically implied, which perfectly sets the stage for the core structure of our deep dive today.
Yeah, it really does.
Because Article 3 was so vague, right? And because it left out the most important details, it created this massive vacuum of uncertainty. And into that vacuum stepped two incredibly sharp minds in 1787 and 1788.
Two very different thinkers.
Exactly. So today, we're going to walk you through a heavyweight historical debate between these two men. They looked at this exact same thin, vague text and saw two completely different futures.
Right. So on one side, we have Alexander Hamilton writing under the pen name Publius.
Okay.
And he promised that this new judiciary would be a harmless, perfectly neutral arbiter.
And then on the other side, we have a writer known as Brutus, who read the exact same text and rang every single alarm bell he could find. He warned of a rogue, self-empowering judicial titan.
So our mission for you today is to hear both of these sides perfectly steel-manned.
No caricatures.
Exactly, no caricatures. We want to lay out their arguments in their absolute strongest forms. We want to look at the mechanics of why they thought the way they did, and then let you decide for yourself who actually predicted the future we live in today.
Because Article 3 was so short, that ambiguity was terrifying to people. And I mean, why wouldn't be? You're being asked to sign a contract where the terms are essentially to be determined.
It's a huge leap of faith.
And we have to remember the context of 1787 and 1788. The Constitution wasn't just magically adopted the day it was signed in Philadelphia.
Yeah, far from it. It was merely a proposal.
Right.
It had to be ratified by the states. And there were these state ratifying conventions where this proposed government was being fiercely debated. The country was deeply, deeply divided.
People were extremely skeptical, right, of creating a new, powerful, distant federal government that could potentially crush their local state governments.
Very skeptical. And the judiciary was not an afterthought in these debates. It was a live, burning worry.
Right, because if you're a citizen in New York or Virginia at that time, your local state court is right down the road. You understand it.
You know the judges.
Exactly. The idea of some supreme, untouchable federal court stepping in and overruling your local laws, that felt like a direct threat to self-governance.
Precisely. So into this massive vacuum of uncertainty and public anxiety, Alexander Hamilton steps up. He publishes Federalist No. 78 in May of 1788.
Okay.
And he is specifically targeting the skeptical voters in New York, which was a crucial state that was leaning heavily against ratifying the Constitution. And this essay is where we get the defining image of the American judge.
But we have to look at Hamilton's essay very carefully, right? Like, we can't just treat it like a textbook definition.
No, and that is a very common mistake. Yeah, Federalist No. 78 is often read today as a neutral, objective, academic description of how courts would inevitably behave.
But it wasn't.
Not at all. Historically, it was a brilliant piece of advocacy. It was a persuasive brief, a highly calculated sales pitch written during a very tense political street fight. Hamilton was trying to win a vote. He needed to reassure people that this new government wasn't going to turn into a tyranny.
He was basically playing PR man for the Constitution.
Exactly.
And his most famous catchphrase from this PR campaign is that the judiciary would be, quote, beyond comparison, the weakest of the three departments. He called it the least dangerous branch.
That phrase, the least dangerous branch, is iconic, but we really need to look at the mechanics of why he claimed it was the weakest.
Okay, let's do it.
Hamilton famously wrote that the judiciary has neither force nor will, but merely judgment.
Okay, wait, let me push back on that. How can Hamilton say they have no force? I mean, if a federal judge today issues a ruling against me and I refuse to comply, armed federal marshals will eventually show up at my door to enforce that ruling. That sounds an awful lot like force to me.
It is a great point, but Hamilton is making a very specific structural argument here about the source of that force. Look at the other branches. The executive branch, the president holds the sword.
Meaning the military.
Right, the executive literally commands the military, the Navy, and the law enforcement apparatus. That is institutional force.
Okay.
Then you have the legislative branch, Congress. They hold the purse strings, they control the taxes, the spending, and they write the laws that represent the active will of the people.
Okay, so Congress has the money and the rules, the president has the guns. What does the court have?
Nothing, inherently. The judiciary has neither the sword nor the purse. They cannot command armies, and they cannot levy a single tax.
So they're completely broke and unarmed.
Exactly. Therefore, Hamilton argues they are completely safe. They just have judgment. They sit in the room, they read the law, and they issue an opinion. But to address your point about the marshals, for that opinion to actually mean anything in the real world, the judge has to rely entirely on the executive branch to enforce it. If the president simply says, "No, I disagree with your judgment and I won't send the marshals," the court is powerless.
Ah, I see. So the court is fundamentally dependent on the other branches to actually do anything. It's like a sports commentator. They can analyze the play and say what the rules are, but they can't physically stop the players on the field.
That's a perfect way to look at it. And from this supposed structural weakness, Hamilton spins a brilliant rhetorical defense. He uses this inherent weakness to defend the most controversial part of Article 3, the tenure of judges.
Ah, the lifetime appointments.
Right. The Constitution says federal judges hold their offices during good behavior, which, unless they are impeached for high crimes, effectively means life tenure.
Now, you really have to put yourself in the shoes of an 18th century American here. You just fought a bloody, grueling Revolutionary War to get away from an unaccountable king who gave jobs to his cronies for life. So the idea of setting up a new government and giving unelected officials jobs for life, that must have sounded absolutely terrifying. It sounds like creating a new aristocracy.
It did. It was one of the major sticking points for the people opposing the Constitution. But Hamilton takes this fear and just flips it.
How so?
He defends this good behavior clause as a stroke of genius. He actually calls it one of the most valuable modern improvements in the practice of government.
Really? A valuable improvement?
Yes, his argument goes like this. Because the judiciary is so incredibly weak, because it lacks the sword and the purse, it needs absolute ironclad independence just to survive.
I see.
If you don't give them life tenure, they will just get crushed by the other two branches.
Right. If a judge has to worry about getting fired by Congress every time they make an unpopular ruling, or, if their salary can be slashed by the president if they rule against the administration.
They'd cave instantly.
Exactly. They aren't going to be a neutral servant of the law. They are just going to be a pawn. They'll be constantly looking over their shoulder, trying to please the politicians instead of actually reading the law.
Precisely. Hamilton argued that life tenure is the only mechanism that allows judges to be pure servants of the text. It insulates them from what he called the passions of the moment.
The mob mentality.
Right. It makes them a sturdy barrier against the encroachments and oppressions of the legislature. Think about it. If the representative body, Congress, gets carried away by a momentary mob mentality and passes a wildly oppressive law that violates the Constitution, who is going to stop them?
Well, the president might agree with the mob.
Exactly. So you need someone who doesn't have to face voters, someone who doesn't have to worry about getting reelected, to stand up and say, no, this violates the fundamental rules we all agreed to.
And that right there, that moment of an unelected judge saying no to a democratically elected Congress, is where Hamilton subtly plants the seed for judicial review.
He does. He absolutely does.
Because remember, we established that this superpower isn't actually written in the text of Article 3. But Hamilton reasons his way into it mechanically in Federalist No. 78.
Yes, and the mechanics of his argument are crucial to understand. Hamilton asks a hypothetical question. What happens if a normal statute passed by Congress directly conflicts with the Constitution? Which one does the judge follow?
Right.
Hamilton argues that the judge must prefer the Constitution, but not because the judge is inherently better or superior to a legislator.
Why then? I mean, why should 9 unelected lawyers get to overrule hundreds of elected representatives?
Because of the concept of popular sovereignty. Hamilton argues that the Constitution represents the permanent will of the entire people. It is the fundamental foundational law that society agreed upon.
Okay.
A statute passed by Congress only represents the temporary will of the people's current representatives. So if the temporary will of the representatives conflicts with the permanent will of the people, the permanent will has to win.
Okay, that makes sense on paper. The Constitution is the boss, the statute is the employee. If the employee disobeys the boss, the judge has to side with the boss.
Exactly. It's a very elegant structural argument. The people created the Constitution. Congress created the statute. Therefore, the people's will overrules Congress's will.
Right.
The judge isn't exerting their own power. The judge is just acting as the neutral referee, pointing at the rule book and saying, sorry, Congress, you crossed a line the people drew for you.
But wait, here is where it gets really fascinating. We established that Hamilton was acting as a PR man for the Constitution, right?
Yes.
He is actively trying to downplay the court's power to win over these skeptical voters. He keeps hammering that they are the least dangerous and have merely judgment. My question to you is, did Hamilton secretly know he was building a Trojan horse?
Oh, that's the big question.
Right. Did he know the judiciary would become incredibly powerful through this mechanism of judicial review? Or did he genuinely believe they would just passively sit there doing legal math?
This is one of the greatest historical mysteries, and it raises a profound question about Hamilton's intent. Based on his writings and his immense intellect, we have to recognize that Hamilton was a brilliant, forward-thinking political strategist.
No doubt.
He clearly contemplated judicial review. I mean,
Right.
He spends paragraphs outlining the exact mechanism for it in number 78. He fully understood that the courts would have the power to strike down laws.
So he knew they were going to be powerful.
He knew they would have a vital, powerful function. But look at how he frames it. He's intensely focused on making that power seem entirely non-threatening.
He's downplaying it.
He frames judicial review purely as a defensive power. In Hamilton's pitch, the courts aren't going to invent new policies, they aren't going to write laws, they're just going to hold up a shield to defend the people's constitution from a rogue, power-hungry Congress.
So he's saying they're just bodyguards for the Constitution.
Exactly. Whether he truly, in his heart of hearts, believed they would never exercise will and would forever remain perfectly neutral, that's something historians endlessly debate. But his immediate overwhelming goal was unequivocally clear.
Which was just to get the votes.
Right. Calm the waters, make the judges sound like boring, harmless scholars, and get the document ratified.
He was selling a promise, the promise of the harmless, neutral arbiter. But while Hamilton was in New York smoothing over fears and writing this elegant theory of the least dangerous branch, there was another writer out there looking at the exact same vague text of Article 3.
Yes, there was.
And this writer was coming to the exact opposite conclusion. If Hamilton was the PR guy for the new government trying to close a sale, this writer was the investigative journalist tearing through the contract looking for all the fatal loopholes.
A perfect description. And this brings us to one of the sharpest, most prescient critics of the proposed Constitution. He was an anti-Federalist writer who published under the pseudonym Brutus.
Now, before we get into what Brutus said, we need to clarify something. We throw the term anti-federalist around a lot in history class, but it's a bit of a misnomer, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Because it sounds like they were just anarchists who hated the idea of a country. What were they actually against?
The term anti-federalist was actually a label slapped on them by their opponents to make them sound purely negative.
Ah, political spin.
Exactly. The anti-federalists were deeply principled. What they opposed was the consolidation of power. They were terrified that this new, massive, centralized federal government in a distant capital would slowly suck all the power away from the individual states.
Right.
They believed that a republic could only survive if power remained local, close to the people. They feared a distant elite ruling over everyone else.
And who exactly was Brutus? Do we know who was hiding behind the pen name?
It is a great historical mystery. The source materials indicate that we still aren't 100% certain.
Really? Still.
It is widely believed by many historians to be Robert Yates. Yates was a prominent New York judge and a delegate to the Constitutional Convention.
Okay.
But he actually walked out of the convention in Philadelphia in protest because he felt they were creating a tyrannical central government instead of just tweaking the Articles of Confederation.
Oh, wow. So he had firsthand experience with these guys.
He did. There is also strong scholarly support for another brilliant New York political thinker named Melancton Smith being the author. But whether it was Yates or Smith, what matters is that Brutus was a serious, deeply analytical legal mind. He wasn't just a rabble-rouser. He was reading the text as closely as Hamilton was.
And Brutus published his essays in the New York press right around the same time Hamilton was publishing his, so late 1787 and early 1788. And in essays 11 through 15, Brutus zeroes in entirely on the judiciary.
And he is absolutely terrified by what he sees.
He is horrified. Brutus read the blank spaces of Article 3. He read Hamilton's arguments for this insulated, life-tenured judiciary, and instead of seeing a neutral arbiter, he saw a complete, catastrophic lack of accountability.
Right. Brutus warned that an insulated court, armed with life tenure, wouldn't just sit there and quietly read the plain, literal words of the text.
Because language is inherently messy, right? It's never just simple math.
Exactly. Brutus argued that because the Constitution is a broad, vague document with words like commerce, necessary and proper, general welfare, judges would eventually have to interpret it.
Right, they have to decide what commerce actually means in the real world.
Yes, and Brutus warned, in a very famous phrase, that they would interpret the Constitution, quote, according to its spirit and reason.
Okay, let's unpack this spirit and reason idea, because it is the core of Brutus's fear. It's like a sports referee.
Yeah, let's hear it.
If you tell a football referee to just enforce the explicit rule book, that's one thing. If a player steps out of bounds, you blow the whistle. It's objective. But imagine telling a referee that they don't just enforce the strict written rules, they can referee based on the vibe or the spirit of the sport.
That is a phenomenal analogy. Let's build that out. What happens when the referee starts ruling on vibes?
Well, let's say there is a completely legal tackle. It doesn't violate any specific rule in the book, but the referee decides, you know what, I feel like that tackle violates the spirit of player safety, so he throws a flag anyway.
Just makes a judgment call.
Exactly. Suddenly, the ref isn't just an impartial arbiter observing the game, he is actively shaping the game. He can just make up new rules as the game goes on, as long as he claims it fits the spirit of the sport. And the players are totally at his mercy.
That is exactly what Brutus foresaw. Because once a judge can reason from the spirit of the Constitution, rather than just being bound by the strict, literal text, the boundaries of their power instantly vanish.
You can do whatever they want.
They can reach nearly any result they want by claiming it aligns with the document's hidden reason. Brutus warned that if judges were given this interpretive leeway, they would naturally use that immense discretion to steadily enlarge federal power at the expense of the states.
Why would they do that, though?
Because expanding the federal government's jurisdiction inherently expands the federal judiciary's jurisdiction. They would be growing their own power.
Ah, so it's self-serving.
Very much so.
But surely someone could stop them, right? I mean, if a referee goes totally rogue and starts making up penalties, the league steps in and fires the referee. And that leads to the thing that terrified Brutus the most. The thing he kept hammering on in his essays was the accountability gap.
Yes. This is where Brutus takes Hamilton's proudest feature and exposes it as a fatal bug.
The life tenure.
Right. Hamilton saw life tenure as a virtue, a way to make judges independent and brave. Brutus looked at that exact same independence and saw a monster being unleashed.
It really is fascinating how two brilliant people can look at the exact same mechanism and see total opposites.
It is. Brutus flips Hamilton's argument entirely on its head. Hamilton says the judicial branch is made safe by its absolute independence.
Right.
Brutus says an independent branch is made uniquely dangerous by that exact same design. Brutus points out that by making the judiciary independent in the fullest sense of the word, you are creating a group of elite individuals who are, quote, exalted above all other power in the government and subject to no control.
Just think about it structurally from Brutus's perspective for a second. There is no power above the Supreme Court to control its decisions.
None.
If they make a ruling based on the spirit of the Constitution and Congress thinks that ruling is completely crazy, Congress can't just pass a regular law to overrule them because the court just established that their interpretation is the Constitution.
Exactly. Short of passing a constitutional amendment, which requires 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states, making it nearly impossible, Congress is helpless.
And there's no way for the people to vote these judges out because they have life tenure. You can't primary them. You can't protest at the ballot box.
And you can't fire them.
Right.
The only mechanism for removal is impeachment. But impeachment is designed for high crimes and misdemeanors, treason, bribery, massive corruption. You cannot impeach a judge simply because you think they interpreted the spirit of the Commerce Clause incorrectly.
So structurally, there is no mechanism to correct a Supreme Court that has decided to systematically reshape the country based on its own philosophy.
Not at all.
So Brutus synthesizes all of this.
Uh-huh.
He looks at Hamilton's beautiful mathematical equation, the idea that courts have neither force nor will, but merely judgment. And Brutus basically says, Alexander, you're being incredibly naive about human nature.
He really does.
Brutus understands that unchecked judgment will inevitably become will. If you give a group of human beings the final, uncheckable say on what the rules of the game mean, and you give them zero fear of losing their jobs, they're going to start injecting their own personal political will into the game.
It's just human nature.
Right. Power corrupts, and uncheckable interpretive power corrupts completely.
And that, right there, is the foundational debate of the American judiciary. It wasn't settled in 1787. You have Hamilton promising a weak, noble, neutral shield for liberty.
Yeah.
You have Brutus warning of an unchecked, self-empowering aristocracy that will devour state power. And they are both looking at the exact same, completely silent text of Article 3.
It is an incredible historical standoff. But to truly understand how Brutus's 18th century warnings apply to the world we live in right now, today, we have to look at a massive shift that neither Hamilton nor Brutus could have possibly predicted.
We do.
We have to look at the math of human biology. We need to spend some time talking about the demographic hinge of the During Good Behavior Clause.
This is an absolutely crucial piece of context, and it fundamentally changes how we evaluate that historical debate.
How so?
Well, the entire argument over life tenure in the 1780s, whether it was a safe protector of independence, like Hamilton said, or a dangerous lack of accountability, like Brutus warned, was operating on 18th century assumptions about human lifespans.
Right. When Hamilton and Brutus were debating, the phrase life tenure meant something very, very different than it does in the 21st century. We have to dive into the medical realities of 1787. What did it actually mean to be appointed to a high court back then?
Life expectancy in the 1780s was significantly shorter. But even if we just look at the life expectancy of adult males who survived childhood, the realities of aging were stark.
Medical care was basically non-existent.
Exactly. Medical care was primitive. There were no antibiotics, no modern surgeries. Furthermore, the job of a Supreme Court justice in the early days was physically brutal.
Wait, physically brutal? How so? I mean, they were just sitting in a courtroom, right?
Not at all. Under the early systems, Supreme Court justices had to ride circuit.
Ride circuit.
Yeah, they didn't just stay in Washington. They were required to travel on horseback or by carriage across vast swaths of the country. They were navigating terrible muddy roads, sleeping in freezing or disease-ridden taverns, just to hear cases in different judicial districts. The physical toll was enormous. Several early justices complained bitterly about it, and it absolutely impacted their health and their tenure.
So, if you were a prominent lawyer or a politician appointed to the Supreme Court in your early 50s in, say, 1795, life tenure might realistically mean a decade on the bench.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe 15 years if you had an iron constitution and managed to avoid yellow fever or a carriage accident. It was a significant appointment, sure, and an honor, but it wasn't a multi-generational lock on political power.
Exactly. In the early days of the Republic, there was a natural turnover. The accountability gap that Brutus feared was somewhat mitigated by the simple biological reality that nobody was going to hold that seat for half a century.
Now let's contrast that with the modern reality. The biological math is completely broken.
It has shattered.
Yeah.
Today we have a system that was perfectly calibrated for 18th century medical realities, but it is now operating in an era of cutting-edge modern medicine, advanced healthcare, and vastly different working conditions.
Nobody is riding circuit anymore.
Right. Justices no longer ride circuit through swamps. They have armies of clerks to help draft opinions.
And as a result, this system now regularly yields judicial tenures of 3 or 4 decades.
It's true.
If a president today appoints a sharp, ideologically reliable judge in their late 40s or early 50s, that justice is fully expected to wield that unchecked interpretive power for 35 or even 40 years.
Which completely changes the stakes of the game. If you go back to our referee analogy, it's the difference between having a referee with a weird interpretation of the rules for 1/4 of the game versus having that same referee officiate every single game your team plays for the next 4 decades with no ability to ever fire them.
That is a staggering amount of power to hand to one human being. And the sources point out that this demographic shift has sparked a massive wave of contemporary scholarship.
Oh, absolutely.
Advocates for modern court reform, people who are pushing for structural changes like 18-year term limits for Supreme Court justices, they are literally picking up Brutus's exact arguments from 1788, dusting them off and using them today.
They absolutely are. The good behavior clause is the absolute hinge on which the entire modern term limit debate turns.
Right.
The argument made by modern reformers is that the accountability gap Brutus flagged has widened into an absolute chasm entirely because of demographics.
Yeah.
30 or 40 years of uncheckable, unreviewable power is a profoundly different institutional reality than 10 years.
So I have to ask you, and I really want you, the listener, to stop and think about this for a second. If the framers in that sweltering room in Philadelphia knew about modern medicine, if they knew they were handing a handful of individuals uncheckable veto power over the national government for 40 years instead of maybe 10 or 15, would Article 3 have been written differently? Does the biological reality of modern aging fundamentally break Hamilton's mathematical equation that the branch is weak?
That is the exact tension driving the modern reform movement. If you truly believe Hamilton's underlying premise, that the branch is inherently weak because it lacks the sword in the purse and therefore can only ever exercise passive judgment, then maybe 40 years of tenure doesn't actually matter.
Right, a calculator is a calculator, whether it's 1 year old or 20 years old.
Precisely. But if you believe Brutus was right, that human nature, combined with the power to interpret the spirit of vague words, inevitably morphs into active policymaking will, then handing someone 40 years of uncheckable will is profoundly dangerous to a democratic system.
It really is.
It means entire generations of citizens are living under rules interpreted by someone appointed before they were even born. This accountability gap isn't just a historical footnote for academics to debate. It is intensely, fiercely contested right now in our modern political life.
Which brings us to the ultimate question. The verdict of the modern era. We have laid out the sparse, muddy blueprint. We have heard the comforting promises from Hamilton in 1788 about the harmless neutral arbiter. We have heard the terrifying prophecies from Brutus about the rogue judicial titan. We've seen how modern demographics have supercharged the stakes. Now, we must ask you to look around at the modern political landscape. Look at the headlines. Apply these historical arguments to what you see today. Who was right?
Well, let's start by looking at Brutus. Was Brutus vindicated by history? When you look at the trajectory of the Supreme Court over the last 2 centuries, it is very difficult not to see his prophecy as incredibly shrewd.
Yeah.
The court did grow incredibly powerful, far beyond what Hamilton publicly promised.
Oh, absolutely. The court isn't just settling minor border disputes between states or figuring out maritime tax law. Its decisions reshape the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people.
Yes, from civil rights and integration to massive economic regulations to reproductive rights to environmental policy.
It's everything.
It is. The court frequently has the final, unappealable say on the most consequential issues in American life. They aren't just calling balls and strikes. They're drawing the very boundaries of what the federal government and the states are allowed to do.
Right.
They decide what the words liberty and equal protection actually mean in practice. That is exactly what Brutus warned about when he talked about unchecked judicial influence interpreting the spirit of the law.
And if you want proof that Brutus was right about the court exercising will, you just have to look at the severe political polarization around the court today. Look at how both left-wing and right-wing factions in this country bitterly, viciously fight over every single open court seat.
Oh, it's intense.
It has become a political blood sport.
It has. Modern confirmation hearings are deeply contentious, nationally televised spectacles. Hundreds of millions of dollars in dark money are spent campaigning for or against nominees.
And we have to be absolutely clear here. We are maintaining complete neutrality on the specific political outcomes of these battles. The left and the right have both cheered and condemned different rulings at different times in history.
True.
That's not the point. The point is that the intense, polarized battle over these appointments only makes sense if Brutus was right.
Exactly. Think about it logically. If the court was truly just exercising merely judgment, as Hamilton promised, if they were just doing a kind of objective legal math that anyone with a law degree would calculate the exact same way, then it wouldn't matter so much who was sitting in the chair.
Right. You wouldn't spend $100 million trying to get a specific mathematician hired because math is math.
Math is math. The intense partisan battles we see today are a structural, institutional acknowledgement by both sides of the aisle that the court exercises will. Everyone in Washington recognizes that the interpretive philosophy of the judge, the lens through which they read the spirit and reason of the text, will absolutely dictate the outcome of major national policies.
Because both sides know that a judge with a different philosophy will read the exact same words and reach a completely different conclusion, which means the law isn't just math, it is shaped by the will of the interpreter.
Yes.
And therefore, capturing that seat for the next 40 years is the most important political prize in the country.
It really is.
So, case closed, right? Brutus wins. Hamilton was either naive or lying, and we are living in Brutus's nightmare of an unaccountable judicial aristocracy.
Well, not so fast.
Yeah.
As we promised at the beginning, we have to steel man both men. We cannot just declare Brutus the undeniable winner without giving Hamilton a fair, robust defense in the modern context.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because there's a very strong, compelling argument that Hamilton's vision, an unaccountable insulated branch, is exactly what is keeping the entire American system from collapsing into tyranny.
Okay, I'm skeptical, but let's hear the defense of Hamilton today. How on earth do we defend a wildly powerful, entirely unaccountable branch in a system that claims to be a democracy? Isn't democracy all about accountability?
It is. But democracy has a fatal flaw, which the founders were acutely aware of: the tyranny of the majority. Defenders of the modern court argue that its vast independence, the life tenure, the lack of elections, the very things Brutus hated and that make modern voters uncomfortable, is the only mechanism that actually protects minority rights and the rule of law.
Explain the mechanics of that. Why does lack of accountability protect minorities?
Because if a majority of the country becomes angry, polarized, and afraid, they will vote for politicians who promise to trample whatever gets in their way.
Okay, that makes sense.
Imagine a scenario where a terrifying national security crisis happens, and 90% of the public demands that a certain religious or ethnic minority be locked up without trial. Congress, eager to please the voters and keep their jobs, passes a law doing exactly that.
The temporary will of the people overriding the permanent will of the Constitution.
Precisely. In that moment, if you're a member of that minority group, you do not want a judge who has to worry about getting reelected. You do not want a judge who is reading the polls. You want a judge who is entirely insulated, unaccountable to the mob, and holds their job for life, so they have the courage to look at the Constitution and say, no, the Constitution guarantees due process. I don't care if 90% of you want this, the mob cannot do this.
Without that life-tenured insulation, the court would just be another political branch bowing to whatever the loudest voices want. They would be a weather vane, not a shield.
Exactly. Defenders of Hamilton's vision argue that the unaccountability isn't a bug in the system. It is the essential feature that makes constitutional rights actually mean something when the chips are down.
Because if it's subject to a vote, it's not a right.
If the fundamental rights of the marginalized are subject to a majority vote, they aren't rights at all. They are just temporary privileges. So yes, the court exercises immense power, but we need them to have that power to act as the ultimate emergency brake on democracy.
Wow. So there it is. The absolute collision of these two worldviews, and this is where we turn it over to you, the listener. You have to decide. We've given you the historical blueprint, the blank spaces, and the modern demographic realities.
A lot to weigh.
It is. Is today's powerful court the dangerous, unaccountable aristocracy that Brutus described, expanding its own power by reading the vibe of the Constitution? Or is that immense insulated power the necessary shield Hamilton promised we'd need to protect our fundamental laws from the terrifying passions of a polarized moment?
It is a profound judgment call, and it is a debate that every single generation of Americans has to have. But to bring this deep dive full circle, I want to introduce a concept that scholars use to understand this founding period.
Okay.
It's called the civic realism thesis.
Civic realism, what does that actually mean in practice?
It means we have to stop viewing the founding fathers as demigods who came down from a mountain holding perfectly carved stone tablets. The civic realism thesis argues that we need to view them realistically as pragmatic, sweating, stressed-out politicians who are making messy deals to prevent the country from falling apart. The founding bargain over the Supreme Court was not a neatly settled, philosophically pristine legal doctrine. It was a contested, messy compromise.
They basically kicked the can down the road because they couldn't agree.
Exactly. Hamilton made a promise, the promise of the harmless, neutral arbiter, under immense political pressure just to get the Constitution ratified. He was selling a product.
In Brutus.
While Brutus, unbound by the need to win votes, saw the institutional reality. Any branch given the final say on the rules of the game will naturally expand its own power. The Constitution we have is a collision of these practical political realities, not a flawless mathematical equation.
And that leads us to the incredible, almost unbelievable historical irony at the center of all of this. We have spent this entire deep dive talking about the awesome power of the Supreme Court to strike down laws, the power of judicial review.
The big superpower.
Right. We talked about how Hamilton foreshadowed it in his essays and how Brutus feared it in his warnings. But we must remind you one last time that superpower is never actually written into the text of the Constitution.
It is a stunning fact. The defining power of the judicial branch finally arrived in the real world in the year 1803, in a famous case called Marbury v. Madison.
Okay.
In that ruling, the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, explicitly claimed the power of judicial review for itself. But they weren't pointing to a specific hidden clause in Article 3 that everyone had missed.
They just willed it into existence.
They claimed it based on an inference. Chief Justice Marshall essentially took the philosophical argument that Alexander Hamilton outlined in Federalist 78, the idea that the Constitution must overrule ordinary statutes, and simply declared that it was the court's job to enforce that dynamic. He read the power into the blank spaces of the blueprint.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as we wrap up today's deep dive. We started by picturing the modern Supreme Court as this solid, permanent architectural marvel. But we dug up the original blueprints and found them basically blank. If the defining superpower of the Supreme Court, the massive ability to strike down laws and reshape the country, isn't actually in the Constitution, if it's not written down, and instead relies entirely on Hamilton's 1788 PR argument that judges must protect the fundamental law.
Right.
Then does the court's ultimate towering authority rest on nothing more than a 230-year-old gentleman's agreement that we simply forgot we have the power to renegotiate?
It is a deeply unsettling yet fascinating question. And once you see the court through that lens, it completely reframes how you look at every single decision they hand down today.
It really does. The marble columns look a lot less permanent when you realize they're built on inferences. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the blueprints.